Hello, I'm Gemma, this is Non-Fic Books, and today I have a review video for you, and that is Fiona MacCarthy's last Curtsey, The End of the Debutantes. And this was published by Faber and Faber in 2006 and is 266 pages long. Fiona MacCarthy was one of these last debutantes in the year 1958, which was the last time that the debutantes curtsied to the Queen at the beginning of the season, which is hence the title. And then since then she went to Oxford, she became a journalist for The Guardian, and then has now become a very well-renowned biographer of people like Lord Byron and William Morris, among others. And this is an interesting look into the 1958 season, and then at the end what has happened to some of these women since then. And this book is both a high and a low, because it's really interesting and yet it has quite a lot of faults. I'll look at the bad stuff first and then go on to the more positive side, because I did still really enjoy this book. The thing that I dislike about it is Fiona MacCarthy doesn't quite seem to know what she's writing here. Whether it's a memoir, whether it's a social history, whether it's political commentary, she just doesn't quite have a focus that's strong enough. The overall sort of wave of the book is she follows through the season, starting at the sort of pre-prep, the Deb's mum's luncheons, and then going through to the presentation, the coming out balls, the horsey events that happen throughout the year, and then finishing up in Ireland and Scotland, and then what has happened since then. And she sort of, part of it is focusing on her experience of it, the parties she went to, the people she knew, and part of it is looking at some of the other Debs, because she's interviewed a lot of other Debs and has a lot of it's great, there's lots of diary entries, photographs, pictures of the invites that were sent out, so it's really interesting from that point of view. But the social history is relatively slim. And then the sort of political stuff that she tries to bring in, because there's definitely a sort of, yes, I was a Deb, but please take me seriously angle to her writing, which sort of takes away from it for a little bit, because she's very defensive of still sort of, she knew at the time that this was the end of something, and part of me is a little bit unsure as to how accurate that really is. How many 17-year-old girls, when presented with a few months of partying and fun and alcohol and boys, really are all that aware of what's going on politically, that this is the end of an era. So I think there is a slight bias because of her attempt to be taken very seriously as quite a left-wing writer and journalist. So I think that does sort of bias some of the recollections that she personally has and her interpretations of some of the social history. But just because she hasn't really focused, she hasn't decided whether this should be a memoir of her own experience or specifically just looking at 1958 or at Debs as a whole. It's too short a book at 266 pages to have trying to uncover all of these things. Really, I would have been far more interested if she'd either picked a focus or written a much longer book, because there were so many different things that I wanted to know that this book didn't quite let me know. Either from the sort of actual experience of what it was like, sorry the bit's a bit heavy so my hand's falling off, like how I would have liked more details about their clothing, the experience of like having to get their hair done, all of that sort of stuff, which was very important, because at the end of the day it was basically a cattle market trying to find husbands for these young girls, and that sort of stuff was very important, and it's brushed upon but it's not looked at in great depth, which I think would have been very interesting if she had been focusing more specifically on the experience of the 1958 season. And the social history is too weak, it's too thin for it to really be taken seriously as a social history book. But that being said, it is a really, I'm going to swap sides, really interesting book, and it's a fascinating time period because it really was the end of an era, and it was very symptomatic of the problems that the aristocracy was having, the increase of democracy, and then all of the sort of changes coming in with country houses, with the absolutely massive death duties that were coming in of 80%, and just the sheer costs of running country houses and the practical aspect of doing it when servants were no longer quite the thing that they had been. And there's an interesting, she does sort of touch on this, but again, if she'd have chosen to follow that route, this could have been a much more interesting book, because I know some people will really not be very interested in learning about these rich girls and the upper sort of echelons of society, but I think it's a really interesting side, even though sometimes she does do the poor little rich girl thing, which sort of clashes with her quite sort of left views that she's trying to maintain that she has and has had since a young age. But it is absolutely fascinating. It's completely bonkers. The whole idea of it to me is completely alien, and so I quite like learning about that. And the characters that she brings up are really interesting. They have gone on to do such a wide variety of things, including one very notorious Deb, who got locked up because of a lot of the things she did for the IRA, which is not really what you expect debutantes to end up doing. But it's just the sort of focus that's really lacking in this book, because it's hugely enjoyable to read. The only slight thing with the writing is occasionally she sort of lists far too many names, and it just, again, that would be fine if this is looking more specifically at the 1958 season and she'd gone on to talk in more depth about all of them, but sometimes there were just far too many names that never reappeared again. They were fine when they were just lists, and then she would go on to discuss these women, because then it was like, oh, so that's who they are, because I don't think most people would actually know who these women were otherwise. But otherwise, it's a great read. Her writing is really enjoyable, and I certainly would be very happy to pick up some of her more in-depth biographies on single people. One thing I absolutely loved was the amount of illustrations, pictures of the invites, photographs of the different women, portraits, quotes from diaries, and the really sort of human side of it. And one of my favourite sorts of photographs, which you can see here, is the sort of more informal pictures of them enjoying themselves, because it's not a side of things you tend to see too often. If you ever hear about the Debs and that sort of stuff, you see the ball dresses, the fancy parties, the cocktail parties, or you think about the Debs Delights, who are the gentlemen, being completely decadent, throwing people in ponds, driving cars into tents full of champagne, and ending up in hospital. Quite a few of the Debs did end up in hospital, some quite seriously, after their absolutely hammered drivers at the end of the party drove them home and ended up driving into lampposts and things like that. So you can definitely see a side of why people totally roll their eyes at the arrogant, stuck-up, entitled sort of generation that some of the young men in here really were from, because you can't really write some of that stuff off as youthful boisterousness, really. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I would recommend it, but I don't think it's going to be a book for everyone. If you are hugely left-wing, if you have no interest in sort of the history of more the sort of class system in the UK and the sort of upper echelons of that, it's probably not for you. If you're really interested, like I am, in the class structure and how important it is and what role it still plays in today, I think you might enjoy this book. And overall, I would recommend it if it sounds like it's something you'd be interested in. But if it doesn't sound like your sort of thing, I don't think there's anything in this book that is going to convince you otherwise. But Fiona MacCarthy's writing, I definitely approve of. I think it's really interesting, and I'm hoping that with a very particular focus like Lord Byron or William Morris, that the problems that occurred in this book won't happen, because they've certainly been very, very well renowned, and I am really looking forward to picking those up at a future date. As always, any questions or comments, leave them down below, and I will see you in this video soon. Bye!